I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Mary Lucero. She's a former USDA scientist and teaches life sciences at New Mexico State University, Alamogordo. She also conducts independent research at Endophyte Enterprises, LLC. She and her husband, David, who's also here, apply their findings to regenerative beef and produce production at JAL Farms. Dr. Lucero is especially committed to developing low-cost, farmer-friendly testing and amendment strategies that guide profitable transitions to regenerative farming practices. Across her teaching, research, and practical farming, she equips growers and consumers with tools and knowledge to advance healthier, more sustainable food systems. Please help me welcome Dr. Mary Lucero to the stage. Forward, back, pointer.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. So I'm really happy to be here. I came to Longmont about 4 years ago and spent about a month working with a grower to develop some composting systems and put on some workshops for microbes, and just really enjoyed the area. I think what you guys are doing in Boulder County is, I will echo what Jay said earlier, this is a fabulous experiment, you know, to look at different ways of managing land, because a lot of what we're doing is not working. And so it's nice to have a little microcosm where you can at least see a different perspective. I have enjoyed the talks so far this morning, but they've also, as often is the case, triggered some new ideas and made me wonder if I really made the right points in my talk here. So we'll see where that goes. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. A little background, since we came up talking about 7 generations back, is that both my husband and I can trace our roots. Now this gets real interesting in terms of how complicated family histories can get. We can both trace our roots to the early 1500s in New Mexico. Farther back than that, you don't have good records. So I believe we were there longer, but the written history gets fuzzy. My husband's family counts 16 generations back to that time. My family counts 9. I'm not the one who always remembers the anniversary. Okay, you could tell which side of the family was more romantic. But we also tease our children. If you go back that far in New Mexico, that always historically had a very small population, those family trees cross. So we tell our kids there what happens when cousins marry. In any case, fortunately, it's many generations back. Okay, but when you have that perspective, and my mother was a history buff, she researched our family history to 1512 before there was anything like Ancestry.com. And so as a result of that, we can all drive up and down I-25, and I feel like Forrest Gump recollecting Lieutenant Dan's stories about people who fell in previous wars. I can see the mesa where the Spanish side of our family went up there very arrogantly and got thrown off the cliffs by the Yakima because they weren't very polite when they demanded water. I can see, I once did research on a plant, the essential oil profile of a plant called Dahlia formosa. We were looking at livestock interactions with plants at the time and looking at which volatiles attracted or repelled livestock. But when I did this profile, it had this beautiful aroma, and I got to talking about it with my mom. I didn't know then that this is the direction aromatherapy was about to become a thing. But doing the essential oil profile of this plant was like an aromatherapy experience. And so I told her about this plant, and I told her, you know, I was researching it. I found it's called Hierba de Alonso Garcia, or the herb of Alonso Garcia. And she got all excited. Oh, he's your ancestor. And she told me the history of Alonso Garcia in New Mexico. who was one of the few that survived the Pueblo Revolt. And if you know the story of the Pueblo Revolt in the 1680, it basically ran circles around Custer's last stand. The Pueblo people all synchronized an attack and ran the Spanish back to El Paso. That's why the towns of Socorro and Isleta in New Mexico are replicated south of El Paso. There's a Socorro and a Isleta because they had to go reestablish their colonies down there. And I guess Alonso Garcia was the one who led the few survivors that went and did that. So I like to think, this is my own interpretation of history, but I like to think that the only reason he escaped was because they let him out. There weren't a lot of survivors, and maybe he wasn't as bad as some of the Spanish that instigated the fighting. So we all twist history in the way that serves us, right? But the point of all this that's probably relevant here is that I realized as I was listening to Louis and Esther this morning that those connections really, if you understand the 7 generations back, it really does influence your appreciation for how we do things moving forward. And I loved the idea of the arrow shooting forward because we can't change the past. But I do know that in many of the accounts my mother found, these Spaniards coming into New Mexico would talk about riding on horseback with grass up to their waist. And I drive through New Mexico today, and I can't help but looking out to those rangelands and thinking, how many generations will it take us to see waist-high grass again? So with that, I'll start out and see if I know how to drive this. Maybe I don't. Oh, there it is. Okay. I want to start out and just talking to people during the breaks and seeing who's here. I know I'm going to get very different answers to this question than I get at a lot of talks that I give. But when I first started talking about soil health, I realized that there were, you didn't know what the audience knew. And so I like to start out by getting some feedback from the audience. How do you guys define soil health? What are some factors that you look for when you're trying to decide if your soil is healthy?
Smells good.
A good smell, okay. Soil structure. It doesn't fall apart, right? When you healthy plants, good color. I'm sorry, good, the ability to hold that water. And here in the West, that's so important because we get so little rain, right?
Balanced microbiome.
Good. Balanced microbiome. That's actually the area that I spent 13 years researching plant microbe interactions with USDA. I was an AR scientist for a few minutes and really developed an appreciation for that microbiome, okay? And kind of the microbiome is the missing piece in agriculture. Anything else that we need to add to that? I'll show you my answer. We'll see if I came up with some of the same points. What do you guys consider the benefits? Why do we care about a healthy soil? What? Clean air. Water. Excuse me. Healthy plants. And what do healthy plants mean for the grower who's trying to make a living with these? More productivity, okay? Higher crop production. More nutrition. What does that mean for us as consumers in a country where 40% of the adults have one or more chronic disease? That nutrient density means a lot. All you have to do is get up to talk and the throat starts scratching. But so here's some widely agreed upon benefits of a healthy soil, okay? Benefits to the grower include the higher crop yield, so you guys got that. More infiltration goes to the water, more plant available water because you have more infiltration, lower irrigation costs, more nutrient dense crops, fewer pests, less disease, okay? Reduced need for inputs. You don't have to spend as much money producing that crop. And for the rest of us, those who aren't directly involved in agriculture, this water management means less runoff and erosion. That means less flooding. We've had a few flooding incidents around the country in recent history, right? It also helps recharge the water table. And how many of you have water use restrictions where you live? Wouldn't it be nice to have more available water? Oh, thank you. Okay. Cleaner environment overall, including biodegradation. You know, I didn't share much of my educational background, but when Jay was talking this morning, my mind was racing back. It sounds like he was launching his career as I was getting educated and prepared for mine. And I remember at New Mexico State in the 1980s, learning about the savory grazing system and learning in kind of a single condensed lecture in an ag course, and then they go on to all the conventional methods. But you'd learn all these ecological principles, and then you'd be taught how technology had advanced beyond that. And it took years of researching plant and microbial ecology to really reach that point where you say, wait a minute, this isn't adding up right, and you question some of that information. But when I was in college, I remember a day that my department head called me in to talk to me. I was a junior in working towards my undergraduate degree. And he says, I just want you to know you have the highest grade point average in our department. And I think, you know, that's kind of nice. I mean, I was working hard. I was trying hard. So I felt patted on the back. And then he looked at me and he says, but don't ever come to me for a letter of recommendation, because I will never recommend a woman for a job in agriculture. And a year later, by that time I was already dating my husband. He stepped out for a minute because we've got a farm to manage and it needed some attention. But he, not surprisingly, landed the first job in agriculture. I ended up teaching public school, teaching science in a middle school long enough to know that that was not what I wanted to do. And to escape middle school, I thought, I've got to look where the jobs were. Well, we were right in the middle of this farm crisis. And he got a job, but he had grown up on a ranch. He had grown up in production ag. I had grown up trying to get back to the ranch or to the life that my grandparents had had. I should have mentioned, because of all these circles that history takes us through, as I listened this morning to the first presentation, I remembered, I thought about the fact that my father actually left New Mexico when we were very young. Some of my first memories are in Springfield, Virginia, Northern Virginia. My mother had a heart attack when I said that as a toddler. She said, oh my gosh, we've got to get back to New Mexico. She's talking like a Southerner. But he went to work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and was instrumental in bringing an end to the boarding schools of that time. So it took us down a very urban lifestyle that we grew up in, but he made sure that we always knew the community we were brought up in. And certainly my mother, who was my grandfather on her side was an Irish guy. That's why I look very Irish, if you will. But she was the one who made sure we knew our history and knew where we came from. And so diverting that, I had come into this field in the middle of a farm crisis in a world that wasn't very friendly to women in ag at the time. And certainly there are reasons why it helps to grow up in agriculture if you are going to start a career in agriculture. So I decided to go into the hard sciences. And the best route out of middle school was to go back to graduate school. And I got my PhD in molecular biology with an interest in bioremediation. And when I went looking for graduate projects, I found out there was a guy working on phytoremediation, or using plants and microbes to clean up toxic waste. And I thought, hey, that's really cool, because I can use some of my ag knowledge on this. And so that's where I ended up working with plants and microbes. But as I was finishing my doctoral work, I was trying to prove we used, how many of you know what Jimson weed is? Okay, so it's a native plant. It's very common in disturbed soils throughout the West. In New Mexico, we were the first recipients of the atomic bomb. And because of all the military testing, there are a lot of sites in New Mexico that have a lot of explosive waste. And so my dissertation research was dealing with, I tell people I've always done really hot work. We were looking at how to remediate some of these high explosives, and Datura does a very good job of it. And part of my research demonstrated that the kinetics, or the degradation speed, of TNT by Datura outperformed anything that bacteria were doing. Okay, and at the time, the term phytoremediation was coined, not by me, but by others, while I was in graduate school. And one of the things that I set out to demonstrate with my dissertation was that it was the plant, not the microbes, that was breaking down the TNT. And so we grew these plants up in test tubes. We used techniques called micropropagation, which is really using plants under aseptic conditions. Datura is a member of the tomato family. It's a solanaceous plant, and it grows very, very well in test tubes. And so we had these very aseptic, quote, microbial-free plants that we were using to demonstrate all this. And about 3 weeks before I defended my dissertation, I still had all these plants in culture, and I went into the lab and plated them all out on different diagnostic media to test one more time that they were truly microbial free. Nothing grew up on the media. Of course, I'd already been through some environmental microbiology training, and I knew that only about 2% of the microbes in the environment can be grown in culture, but I was also following the techniques I'd been trained in. My plants came out clean. I showed them to the tech. I said, yay, I passed the last test. Now I'm ready to wrap up my lab work, defend my dissertation, and go home. And he kind of chuckled, and he says, well, according to everything I've been trained, you're correct. But you might want to talk to Jerry Barrow before you make up your mind. And I'm like, who's Jerry Barrow? And he says, oh, he's some USDA scientist who thinks all plants are high-order lichens. Now, a lichen is a plant that is it's all that crusty stuff that you see on the rock in the mountains, and it grows in a symbiotic relationship with algae. It's a fungus and an algae living together. And he sat down and so 2 days later, I'm knocking on his door, and he sat me down and showed me beautiful micrographs he had taken of plants growing inside, of fungi growing inside micropropagated plants like mine. And I remember, because I was going through basically a plant genetic engineering program, so I learned all these techniques that we use in plant biotechnology. And I remember getting goosebumps looking at his data, thinking, we've missed a big part of the picture in plant biology. And from that minute on, I did everything I could to arrange a position working close to Jerry Barrow. I didn't get hired by Jerry Barrow's lab immediately. I got hired at USDA by an animal and range science group looking at plant volatiles. That's why I was doing essential oil work. And interestingly enough, looking at the Halter group in the back, I worked, one of the people in that group was Dean Anderson, who has since retired. He lives here in Colorado, and he devoted about 30 years to researching virtual fencing. So any of you that are using virtual fencing, this is one of the people that developed that technology. Okay, so I'm getting a little bit off the subject, but that tells you a little bit where I came from. And back to the benefits, certainly, so I landed this unit at the Jornada Experimental Range with USDA, and it was a very integrated research unit. We had a 78,000 hectare rangeland facility. We called it our lab without walls. And actually a lot of the research that went into supporting NRCS for the soil health classifications and ecological site descriptions, at least in the Southwest, was coming out of our unit. I wasn't involved directly with those, but I was certainly present at the talks and talking to the scientists and hearing all this stuff develop while I played in the lab with plants and microbes. As my time at USDA increased, climate mitigation became a bigger and bigger part of that picture. And we started realizing, as I eventually got to work with Jerry Barrow, and we're really seeing how intimately integrated these plants and microbes were. I actually published the first research paper that used the terminology of microbiome in describing a plant. So we were seeing these big benefits to the general public in addition to the benefits to the land managers as a result of things like climate mitigation, biodiversity, and bottom line, a stronger economy, because at some level, farming and ranching is like the base floor that fuels all economies, and that will be true as long as we continue to eat. How many of you actually eat? Come on, I think there's more than that. Okay. So what do we mean by a nutrient-dense plant? Well, basically that, we kind of talked. Okay. Well, a nutrient-dense plant is going to benefit the grower with higher yields. It's going to have fewer pests. It's going to have less disease. Because it has less disease, the grower doesn't need to spend as much on pesticides. They can get higher premiums for their crop. We need more research on this idea, but thinking back over my lifetime, I remember when you could buy a head of lettuce and leave it in the refrigerator until it was gone, until you'd eaten it all. And now you buy a head of lettuce and 2 days later, 3 days later, it's not good anymore. The same's true. How many of you buy oranges that are just kind of mushy inside? They don't have the crispness, okay? I believe the shelf life improves as you improve the microbial composition and the nutrient density of the plant. I'd like to see more hard science in that area. But for the rest of us, this helps with more nutrition. And this is where we circle back to the announcement that Jay brought up this morning, with USDA finally acknowledging the need for regenerative agriculture, not just for the farmer and farm economy, but also for human health benefits. I really believe that much of our chronic disease epidemic is due to problems in the soil. And I once sat down and did a little digging through history to see if I could come up with a number of people or a percentage of the population that was affected by the Black Death in Europe. And it's hard to make good estimates dealing with the past like that, but the estimates I found range from 28 to 35%. We have 40% of the adults in this country sick all the time. So this is, thank goodness, it's not infectious disease and we're not falling down on the streets like people did during the Black Death, but we're certainly dealing with a serious public health problem. And I think a lot of that, in terms of benefits to the public then, would be lower health care costs and increased productivity. You can do more when you feel good. The food has a better flavor. And nutrient-dense food also promotes more satiety. You enjoy the food more, you fill up, and you eat less. Longer shelf life. Okay, so where we're going on this presentation and where Lauren kind of asked me to go is talking about the soil health and the 5 principles for maintaining it. I think to some extent I'll be preaching to the choir here on that. We want to describe the roles of the local environment and native biology in building soil health. And we want to look at the relationship between soil health, and plant productivity and nutrition, okay? And then kind of the practical aspect of this is that we're going to talk about when to conduct some of the common soil and plant testing lab work that's available. I share some of Jay's opinions about the more you can do without a laboratory, the better. But lab tests can be informative, and especially if the on-site, low-cost observations aren't answering your questions, it's good to have something to dive a little bit deeper into. Plus, a lot of times government programs and companies that you've contracted with may be requiring some of these tests, okay? So we'll talk about some of what tests can and cannot do, how to interpret the lab results, and how to use the data to optimize fertility and plant performance. And so what is soil? Well, soil, of course, according to an NRCS definition, is a vital living ecosystem, okay? And what I learned in ag school back in the dark ages is that there's 5 components to soil. Soil contains air, soil contains water, soil contains minerals, rock, parent material, whatever you want to call it. It's ground up minerals, which contain a lot of elements, a lot of that stuff on your periodic chart. So the parent material is the source of your mineral nutrients. And soil contains organic matter, decomposed plants, decomposed animal tissues, lots of microbial residues. I like to think of the organic matter as the food for living systems. This is our source of sustainable, renewable energy because all life requires energy. When I'm teaching, and I do wear several hats. We've got our farm. By the way, my husband has come back in. So David, if you'll just raise your hand. He's the boots on the ground on our farm. And I still do some independent research and consulting with Endophyte Enterprises. Recently, I went back to New Mexico State University. I'm teaching biology there. But as I teach biology, we talk a lot about ATP as the currency of the body. It keeps that energy cycling. And that comes out of so the organic matter is what we need to make ATP with. It's what we need to make energy with. And soil also contains life. It's not soil if there's nothing living in it. So life is an integral component of soil. If you think back to the first life, Earth 4 billion years ago had a much more serious problem with global warming than we have today. There was a lot more methane in the atmosphere. There was a lot less oxygen in the atmosphere. And it was life, the first life, microbial life, that changed all that. If we want to clean up and restore the environment where we are today, we need life. We need more of the first life, and we need that microbial life in the soil. Okay? There's no such thing as a dead ecosystem. So if soil is a vital living ecosystem, you have to have that life. And all life comes from the soil. And this is something that we don't need science to tell us. And the reason I say we don't need science to tell us that is because it's an idea that's integral or indigenous, if you will, to most cultures, okay? Now you might say, wait a minute, the oceans are teeming with life. What about aquatic life, okay? Well, let's go back to what soil's made out of. Air, water, parent material, organic matter, and life. Now think about the ocean. All the ocean is, and all the lakes and rivers and aqueous bodies on the planet, all of those are just wet soil. Okay? All life comes from the soil. And this knowledge or awareness that life comes from the soil predates modern science. It transcends religion. It transcends culture. If you look at the 3 major monotheistic religions of the world, they all trace back to the book of Genesis in some way, where we say that the Lord God formed man out of the clay. Okay? Hindu religions, Mahatma Gandhi said to forget how to dig in the earth and tend the soil is to forget ourselves. And looking at the Americas, where we come from, we are part of the earth, and the earth is part of us. Okay, so all these global religions and belief systems have some element of life coming from the soil. My family originated in the northwest corner of New Mexico. I say originated. In the last century, we originated, and we've been. My father's family ranched kind of in between the Zuni and the Navajo Nation, with a lot of influence from both cultures and a strong understanding that I later learned probably came from those influences. He had the Yakima near him. He had all these different Pueblo influences. But despite the Irish Catholic component and the Hispanic Catholic component, there was very much an awareness that we came up from the soil, okay? So if we deem life itself as sacred, we need to also accept that the soil is sacred. And to continue the NRCS definition, we've got the continued capacity of the soil. Soil health then would be the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and nutrients. That continued capacity refers to the next 7 generations. Okay, we've got to look at the ability to keep that vital living ecosystem vital and living into the future. Okay? So healthy soil is not just about getting you through the next harvest. It's about building capacity for the future. We see a lot of elderly farmers that are dealing with a sense of loss because their children have no interest in coming back to the farm or to the ranch. My husband often shares the story that when he left for college, his father's telling him, whatever you do, don't major in agriculture. And he's like, why not, Dad? Aren't we ranchers? And he tells, are you stupid? Look at how hard this life is. It was, again, this was the 80s. This was very hard times. And why should a child come back as an adult to work on a farm that is not capable of providing a living for them? If we want our children to come back or to take over the farm as we grow old, we need to build a system that rewards them for doing that. Okay, so principles, we talk a lot about soil health principles, and principles are just guidelines. In human health, we live by some principles. You want to eat well, you want to stay hydrated, you want to exercise, okay? You want to avoid some landmines, you want to stay away from real toxic behaviors like walking into a room when you're 4 feet tall and taking on the biggest person in the room, challenging them to a duel. You want to avoid toxic substances, minimize that drinking or whatever, and stay away from those people that just zap you, okay? All these things will help ensure a long life. Positive thinking will help ensure a longer life. If you do all these things, that's not going to keep you from walking out across the highway and getting hit by a truck, okay? You may not live a long life, but you're ensuring the likelihood of that, and you're ensuring the likelihood of lower healthcare costs, okay? Soil health principles are similar. Following the principles is not going to guarantee a profitable farm or ranch, but it's going to nudge you down that road a little bit. It's going to increase the odds of a successful outcome. So the 5 soil health principles: cover it up, keep something covered on that soil. Something I learned in the desert rangelands, I mean, the Jornada Experimental Range is part of we're in the northern Chihuahuan Desert, so very much a desert ecosystem, a hot desert ecosystem. And what we learned about the soil microbes in the Chihuahuan Desert and elsewhere is that the reason we get such massive windstorms that blow all this dust, and I see you guys get those here on the high range as well, has to do with disturbance of the soil. If you go into the few more pristine areas that exist, it can get windy. You don't get the dust. And the reason for that is because even though you can't see it, you've got this layer of microbes on the soil surface that contain cyanobacteria and fungi that weave together networks that hold that soil to the ground better than a landscape fabric, okay? They keep that soil in place, and so the wind can come and you don't get as much erosion. This is why many of your public lands now in the West have signs about don't bust the crust. A scientist by the name of Jane Belknap did a lot of work with USGS defining those cyanobacterial components of the soil crust layers and bringing attention to their importance for soil stability. So keep that soil covered. You want to minimize disturbance. On open rangelands, keep those 4-wheeler tires in limited areas, okay? Tires are much harder than hoof prints on a landscape. In the field, there are times when you might argue, yeah, we need to till. There are crop types that are really difficult to imagine successful no-till, at least with the equipment you may still be paying off on your farm. So minimize the disturbance. Look for ways that you can reduce the number of times you go through and turn that soil over. Maximize biodiversity. We've heard a lot about that today, but I'll talk a little bit later about why some of the biochemical principles and microbial principles that make that biodiversity important. Okay, maintain living roots, keep plants on that soil. don't till your stubble in the fall. I used to see this a lot in southern New Mexico. As soon as the crop was done, it would get tilled in. Sometimes that was prescribed by policy to reduce pests. And then you've got bare soil all winter with the wind blowing. Okay, I better hurry up. I've told too many stories. Integrating native plants might improve soil health. Remember I told you we discovered all those microbes living inside the plants? With native plants, these are microbes and plants that have evolved for thousands of years in your ecosystem. They're going to tolerate the soil type. They're going to tolerate the changes that impact that. All soils were built by local ecosystems, okay? These rocks and minerals were not distributed evenly across the planet. And the native plants often have deeper roots. They have indigenous microbes, and all of this system evolved under local conditions. A lot of plants and microbial systems are adapted to dry climates. Okay, we have microbes we call halophytes that tolerate salt. Alkalophiles tolerate high pH. Thermophiles tolerate what? Heat. Okay, xerophiles like it dry. Do we have any of these conditions on the Front Range? Okay, so research into how these local biota might support cotton production or beet production or wheat production has been limited, and there are a few studies on this area, but really it's an area that much more research is needed. I left USDA when a national program leader told me they would never support an effort that does not benefit the agrochemical companies, because I realized that day why it had been so hard to get our work funded. And so it's not that this thing will or won't help, it's that we can't tell you for certain that some of this will help. And I love the idea of starting small. That's kind of on our own farm, we have integrated small amounts of natives. You can start by minimizing the tillage and what I call the sidle practices, herbicide, pesticide. They're basically, if it's sidle, it is killing something. Okay, we're trying to promote life, not death. The wind and the water will deliver a lot of native microbes. It will deliver the microbes you need. Now, if you're going in repeatedly and disturbing your field, if you're doing vegetable crops that really require tillage and this kind of thing, or that we haven't always developed good no-till methods for, you might want to use biologicals. But if you're doing more permanent crops, just just feed them and they will come. Okay, you really want to build sufficient soil carbon. Soil carbon is food for the microbes. And we have built this assumption that plants take up all the carbon they need from the atmosphere. The atmosphere is like 0.3% carbon dioxide. The plant body, like our bodies, is about 50% of the dry matter is carbon. Okay, we expect plants to need nitrogen from the soil, but get all their carbon from the air. There's a lot more nitrogen in the air than there is carbon, and the plants need a lot less of it. But rhizophagy, like Jim White that Jay mentioned talks about, explains that fungi from the soil move up into the plants and deposit their carbon there. The plants eat them, if you will. So carbon is moving from the soil as well. It's feeding your plants. You can try including native plants in borders or side areas or cover crops, okay? They'll reduce your wind and water erosion. Deep-rooted native plants can start feeding the root zone and mining minerals from deep in the soil. They provide a unique inoculum of microbes because every native plant is associated with hundreds or thousands of unique microorganisms. Start slow, observe the results before you expand. And how much time do I have? About 3 minutes. Let's see where this goes. Okay. So our experience, okay, most of this is coming from our farm where we raise, we've got a fruit orchard and we do some pasture-raised beef, okay? And then some of it's coming from my work at the Jornada. I spent a lot of time looking at blue grama and other native grasses there. Any of the Butylloa species are great forage. At least most of them, I should say. Your side oats, your blue grama, your black grama. But they can be difficult to establish, and this difficulty certainly varies by your location. Once they're established, they're prolific. Indian rice grass is one that I just really like that grass, and I haven't been able to establish it pretty much anywhere I've tried. Now, I understand they're actually growing it as a crop in Montana. Maybe it establishes better there, or they have some good mojo that I don't have. But it's really good forage. One that surprised me that we've had good luck with on our irrigated orchard and pasture cover crops is yellow coneflower. Now, I'll say it's not the best cattle forage, but it's very easy. It has been easy for us to establish. It integrates well with the cover crop. It's a low-growing forb. And what it brings to the table, since it's not really something that cows like, is it supports a lot of beneficial mycorrhizal fungi, okay? Now, the bug in the jug, the commercial formulas, like I say, they're good when you've had a lot of disturbance. They're convenient. They can, if you're not raising native plants, the justification for native microbes is still there, but maybe not so much. A diverse mix of plant growth promoting microbes can still boost plants that are subject to disturbance or neglect. The cons, of course, are they're likely non-native. They may not survive in your soil, and the price. So depending on the problem you have, that's kind of what we're doing. And I'm going to skip this and look a little bit at less at the summary and more at the nutrients, because I think part of what you're trying to do is sorry about that, I put way too much in here. But you want to make sure you're getting all your nutrients in there, okay? And so again, there's some discrepancy among different publications about what nutrients plants need. You're getting your hydrogen and oxygen if you're watering your plants, okay? But carbon has been a neglected nutrient in plant biology for a long, long time. And nitrogen has been over-promoted. And going back to this national program leader that said we will never support a program that doesn't benefit the agrochemical companies, the belief that you need a lot of added nitrogen clearly supports agrochemical companies. And that's the story we've all been told. Nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur are all the macronutrients. Those are things you need a lot of for plants, particularly nitrogen. But you need to remember you've got thousands of microbes in the soil that are capturing that nitrogen from the atmosphere and feeding it to your plants and your soil. So the amount you need to add is actually a measure of how well your microbial community is working in your soil. It's not a matter of how much you have taken out and harvested with your crop. And so we're using the wrong formulas to determine nitrogen needs. Here are some of your micronutrients and their functions. And I point these out. The three at the bottom, especially the last two, are debated. And it may be that some plants need them, some plants don't. But we have found that if we focus our soil tests on what micronutrients are missing, we get more bang for the buck than following the prescriptions about how much you need to add based on a soil test, okay? Because if those micronutrients aren't there, your microbes can't do their work. And the biggest one, again, is carbon, which is your soil organic matter. So if your soils are lacking organic matter, your microbes are starving. They don't work if they're hungry. nutrients can compete with one another, and a really great book that I saw on Jay's list is Michael Astra's The Ideal Soil, for explaining the right balance that you need on those. Excess nitrogen might improve your yield because plants grow very quickly, but it's also going to contribute to things like those soft oranges we buy in the store. They don't make good cell walls when you feed them too much nitrogen. Okay, you see a decrease in the nutrient density if you put too much nitrogen. You also see a decrease in pest resistance. This is real good for the agrochemical companies because now, in addition to buying nitrogen, you need to buy pesticide. It decreases the disease resistance, the shelf life, okay? And I like to say it creates a drug-addicted soil because the more nitrogen you add, the fewer nitrogen-fixing microbes you have in your soil, and the more nitrogen-degrading microbes you have, denitrifying microbes. So the more nitrogen you put, what's that? Did I get an extension? Yes. Okay. The more microbes you put, the more nitrogen you put, the more you're building that population of denitrifying microorganisms, which means that the more you put, the more you're taking your the microbes are taking your hard-earned money and turning that back into atmospheric nitrogen that just goes away into the air. So if you feel like your money is just going into the air, you're right. Okay? Excess nitrogen increases that denitrifying bacterial population while it decreases the nitrogen-fixing population. So what do you do with this? Well, there are a lot of tests available out there that can help you determine what your soil needs, okay? Standard soil chemistry tests are probably the longest standing and the most widely used methods out there. And they can actually give you more information than I realized when I started this bit about trying to get the word out to growers about microbes. Leaf tissue tests and sap analysis have been what we have come to rely on heavily on our orchard and on our pastures because they give you very real-time measurements of what you need. And microbial testing, I used to give a talk called Every Farmer Needs a Microscope, or Why Every Farmer Needs a Microscope. And I kind of did that knowing inside what, you know, one-size-fits-all solutions never work. And so I no longer believe that every farmer needs a microscope, but it's good to have an appreciation for what that microbial community is doing. So my suggestions are that you find a lab that you enjoy working with that provides reliable results, and then stick with them, because you want to be able to look at your lab results over and over across the years. This isn't a one-time solution. This is something you're going to commit to for the lifetime of your soil. Follow their instructions for sampling and submitting your samples, because they all use different methods. So they're counting on you following their instructions. You might not get the answers you need if you don't follow their instructions. And test at the same time. We test annually at the same time every year, just to keep track of what's happening, okay? The tests generally include pH, organic matter, nitrogen, macronutrients, cation exchange, soluble salts, and base saturation. And any of you can come back and ask about these, because I really need to move on. But I've got a couple of soil test samples here, and I'll point out, let's see what I can skip. This is one that we took. It actually shows one of our big mistakes, okay? We have a very high pH in our soil, and this was a new field that we started working on, okay? But the organic matter was really low, 1.1%. You want it above 3, okay? I won't go into all of this, But what we did to amend this is, of course, we had a cover crop. We increased the mowing height, okay? Because we were kind of keeping it low to keep seed production down. And we found that that actually did increase the soil carbon, okay? Plant sap testing is what we use to decide what nutrients to add. I rely on the soil test to tell me if that organic matter is increasing, if the base saturation ratios are improving. But what I add comes from plant sap testing because it's the plant that I'm trying to feed. And I know I raced through those. I'll make this available. They are giving me the stage hook here. So I will stop. What's that? Yes, yes. Are there questions? Are you trying to ask? Okay.
No.
Yes.
Colin, can you put the questions up? Thank you. Okay.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Okay, here we go. You can read that.
Okay, why do plants sequester carbon from the soil when they can get it from the air? They do both. You know, the plants are taking carbon in from the atmosphere all the time because that supports photosynthesis. So they pull it in through the leaves. But they are also taking it in from the roots. Plants need a lot of carbon. And one of the things that soil microbes do to support that is translocate carbon from the soil into the plant to support the carbon uptake. We used to use a stain that was specific for fungi when we'd look at plants that were growing across seasons, and we would find these fungal hyphae moving right up in between the veins of the plant, in between the phloem and xylem tissue of the plant. And they were loaded with little lipid bodies, and depending on the season, we never got the funding to really study the directionality of this, but what we inferred from what we saw, to make a long story short, is that during that rainy season, when you get this pulse of energy, and it's really the only time in the desert that you get photosynthesis occurring, would see the massive lipid bodies moving down into the roots. And the rest of the year, we perceived the carbon was feeding the plant and supporting it when the temperature was too high or the weather was too dry to support photosynthesis. It's the ideal soil beneficial to native plants too. The formula probably varies. And again, it's an area that not a lot of research is there, but I think the ideal soil would be the soil that has the conditions where you find large acreages or large stands of these native plants thriving. So if you know what those conditions are, and ecological site descriptions do a good job of describing that. So talk to your NRCS people. If you can match those conditions, you should have better conditions for the native plants. Will soils adapt to a new environment like plants and seeds will over a few seasons? Soil microbes will adapt faster because they have shorter lifespans. And so those that are adapted will that are not adapted will either go extinct or turn on new sets of genes. Microbes are promiscuous little critters, and they can pass DNA from one to another pretty quickly. And so a lot of dynamics are possible, but they do adapt more quickly.
And one more.
How would you suggest balancing to try to build your soil organic matter? Okay. To me, the cover crop, a multi-species cover crop, is the best way to add organic matter on a budget. Now, if you have access to free biochar or humic acids or some of these, they're great, but those can get costly if you're paying money for it. I will say, this is probably the most interesting thing I've seen looking at soil tests. There's a group that I have worked with on the Navajo Nation that was growing, they do a lot of permaculture type work, and she was coming to me with a lot of questions about her soil tests and how to improve what she was doing, and she didn't have enough organic matter. Few people in New Mexico do. And I thought, you really need to build the organic matter. We talked about some things she should do, and then like we often do, you know, if a little bit is good, a lot is great. She put bales of hay in this small garden, and the next summer she had a lot of pill bugs and this kind of thing in there to where it was almost problematic. But the next year, she sent me a soil test, and in that alkaline soil at 7,000 feet, she still had a high pH, but everything else matched Michael Astra's recommendations for the ideal soil. She had the nutrients cycling, she had everything happening, and her organic matter was up around 4.5, I believe, if I remember correctly. Okay, thank you for your patience with my